From the res life, big lessons for the world, dreaming big.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Willie Cheez Education Channel. My name is Delmar, and I love to write stories and read them back to you, inspiring you to learn through the power of storytelling. Through the adventures of Willie Cheez stories, we explore personal development, Navajo culture, ceremonies, native histories, and life lessons that will help you grow and connect with both tradition and modern life. And I'm excited to share with you on a new story called Willie Cheez Learns the Truth About Reservations. Part 1, A Curious Question. Willie Cheez was always full of questions, especially when it came to the history of his people. One afternoon, as he sat with his grandfather, he asked a question that had been on his mind for a long time. "Grandfather, what are reservations? Why do we live on them? And what's the real reason they were created?" His grandfather, a man who had seen many things in his lifetime, and who carried the stories of their people, looked at Willie with a serious expression. He knew this was not an easy question to answer, but he also knew it was important for Willie to understand the truth. "Willie," his grandfather began, "to understand reservations, you have to understand the history of this land before it became what we now call the United States. Long before Columbus or any Europeans set foot on this continent, this land was home to many different tribes. Our people, the Dene, lived freely across the vast stretches of what is now the Southwest. Other tribes, too, had their own lands, their own ways, and their own connections to the earth. The land was not something to be owned, it was something to be respected, something that gave life." Part 2, The Arrival of Europeans. When Columbus came in 1492, and later when European settlers began to arrive in greater numbers, everything started to change. These newcomers had different beliefs about the land. They saw it as something to conquer and possess. They didn't understand, or didn't care, that the land was already inhabited by millions of people with their own cultures and ways of life. As the Europeans spread across the continent, they began to push native people off their ancestral lands. The U.S. government, formed after the American Revolution, played a significant role in this process. They made treaties with native tribes, but these treaties were often broken. The goal was to take as much land as possible by any means necessary. Part 3, The Creation of Reservations. As the U.S. expanded westward, it became clear that the government saw native people as obstacles to their vision of a vast, unified country. The solution they devised was to remove native tribes from their lands and confine them to specific areas, which they called reservations. "Reservations, Willie," his grandfather said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "were not created to protect us or to give us a place of our own. They were created to isolate us, to control us, and to strip us of our lands and our way of life. In many ways, they were like prison camps, places where we were forced to live under the watchful eye of the government, with little freedom to live as we had before." Some of these reservations were established in areas far from the tribe's original homelands, often in places that were harsh and uninhabitable. The U.S. government justified this by claiming it was for the protection of native people. But the reality was that they wanted to free up more land for settlers, miners, and railroads. The Navajo, for instance, were forcibly removed from their homeland during the Long Walk and placed at Bosque Redondo, a barren, inhospitable place where many died from starvation, disease, and exposure. Other tribes faced similar fates, being moved from fertile lands to areas where they struggled to survive. Part 4, The Lakota and the Great Sioux Nation. Willie's grandfather leaned in closer, his voice dropping as he spoke about another example of the government's betrayal. The Lakota, part of the Great Sioux Nation, had their lands in what is now the Black Hills of South Dakota. These lands were sacred to the Lakota people, central to their culture and spirituality. But in 1868, the U.S. government signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which guaranteed the Sioux ownership of the Black Hills. Willie listened closely, knowing that this part of the story would be just as painful as the last. But just a few years later, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Suddenly, the treaty meant nothing to the government. They wanted the gold, and they didn't care about the promises they had made to the Sioux. So, they broke the treaty, sending in miners and soldiers to take the land. The Lakota fought to protect their land, but they were eventually overwhelmed. The government seized the Black Hills, and the Sioux were forced onto reservations, lands that were poor, where nothing could grow, where life was a constant struggle. The lands given to the Sioux were some of the worst imaginable, barren, infertile, and isolated. They were deliberately chosen to be places where the Sioux could not thrive, where they would be dependent on government rations that were often inadequate and spoiled. The government's betrayal was complete when they refused to return the Black Hills, despite multiple legal battles and even a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court in 1980 that recognized the Black Hills had been taken illegally. Instead of returning the land, the government offered monetary compensation, which the Sioux have refused, insisting that the land itself must be returned. Part 5. The Reality of Prisoner of War Camps. Some people might not realize this, Willie, but reservations were often established in areas that the government didn't want. They were far from cities, far from the resources that had made our ancestors thrive. And yes, in many ways they were like prison camps. The government restricted our movements, controlled our resources, and tried to assimilate us into their way of life. We were expected to abandon our languages, our traditions, and our spiritual practices. Willie's grandfather paused, then continued, his voice filled with emotion. Do you know that some reservations were actually established on the sites of former prisoner of war camps? For example, Fort Sill in Oklahoma was originally a military post used to confine Native American prisoners of war. Thousands of Native Americans were held as prisoners at Fort Sill and other similar camps, treated not as citizens or even human beings, but as obstacles to the government's plans. The numbers of Native people who were confined to reservations during this time were staggering. By the late 19th century, over 300,000 Native Americans had been placed on reservations, many of which were just small fractions of their original lands. These reservations were often overcrowded and lacked basic resources, leading to high rates of poverty, disease, and death. Part 6. The Legacy of Reservations. Willie, his grandfather said, the truth is that reservations were never meant to be places where we could thrive. They were designed to keep us out of sight and out of mind. But despite everything, our people survived. We adapted. We held on to our language, our culture, and our identity. Today, many reservations still struggle with the legacy of this history. Poverty, lack of access to education and health care, and ongoing challenges to our sovereignty. But we are still here. We are still fighting for our rights, for our land, and for our future. Willie listened in silence, the weight of his grandfather's words sinking in. He had always known that life on the reservation was hard, but he had never fully understood the reasons behind it. Now he saw the reservation for what it truly was, a place born out of injustice, but also a place where his people had shown incredible strength and resilience. The importance of knowing the truth. As Willie Cheez sat by the fire, his heart heavy with the knowledge he had just gained, he knew that this truth was something he needed to carry with him. Understanding the history of reservations wasn't just about learning the past. It was about understanding the present and how it had shaped his life and the lives of his people. The story of reservations was a story of loss, of forced removal, and of survival against overwhelming odds. But it was also a story of resilience, of a people who refused to be broken, who held on to their identity and their way of life despite everything that was taken from them. But Willie's grandfather wasn't done. Willie, it's important to understand that while this history is painful, it's not something we should use to blame others or to hold ourselves back. Yes, we have faced great injustices, and yes, we continue to struggle because of them. but we cannot afford to be weighed down by anger or bitterness. This history has made us stronger, more resilient, and more united as a people. He looked at Willie with a steady gaze. Today, we have the opportunity to rise together, to build a future that honors our past but doesn't let it define us. Imagine what we could achieve if all Native people worked as one, if we supported each other, lifted each other up, and used the strength that has been passed down through generations. We could create a future where our people are not just surviving, but thriving. A future where we reclaim our lands, our resources, and our rights. A future where we are not just part of this country, but leaders in it, contributing our wisdom, our culture, and our spirit to the world. Willie felt a surge of hope and determination. He understood now that knowing the truth wasn't about finding someone to blame, it was about finding a way forward. The history of reservations, with all its pain and suffering, was also a history of survival, of strength, and of a people who had never given up. "We are still here," his grandfather continued, "and we are stronger because of what we've been through. We have the power to shape our future, to ensure that our children and grandchildren have opportunities we could only dream of. But it starts with us, with each of us doing our part, working together, and never forgetting where we came from." As the fire burned low and the night grew darker, Willie Cheez made a silent promise to himself and to his ancestors to honor their legacy, to tell their stories, and to continue the fight for justice, for sovereignty, and for the land that had always been theirs. But most importantly, to work towards a future where Native people rise together, stronger and more united than ever before. And in that moment, Willie knew that the journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. And that's today's story from the world of Willie Cheez. I hope it sparked some new thoughts, inspired growth, or brought you closer to understanding our shared journey. Remember, every story carries a lesson, and it's up to us to live it out. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and always honor where you come from. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.
From the res life, big lessons for the world, dreaming big.